Hi everybody, Adam Steele here, and today's video is a bit of a think piece where I'm going to tell you about why I've gone back to using NS10s, or at least clones of NS10s. Let's talk about why. So I recently did a project with Ramesh, who produced the Bring Me the Horizon album, Ammo, amongst loads of other stuff. He's very much a legend in the UK metal community and known around the world. And he's a lovely guy, and he was checking out a mix that he'd done for a band called Florence Black, which he was finishing up the mix in his control room at Longwave, where he does the control room and all that kind of stuff. And it sounded incredible, and I thought he was using these big Genelecs, and they had big Quested main monitors. And I asked him, what are you using? And he was using Yamaha NS10s. Specifically the Yamaha NS10M Studios, with this massive subwoofer underneath the console. And I was just really impressed with how clear everything sounded, and it really got me thinking, it got my brain ticking. In years past that I've mentioned almost as a throwaway that I have these NS10s from Studio Spares, which are basically clones of the old Yamaha NS10s, you know, the white speakered boxes from the 80s, as Chris Lord-Alge would say, the sound of hits. And I was just thinking about, why do these people go for these speakers? What's good about them? Are they actually good at all? And I think part of the appeal is, no, they're not very good. I have the Evodio SC207s behind me there, and those are great speakers. They've got quite a lot of low end for what they are. They've got a smooth top end that's not an extended, super bright top end. And that again got me thinking. I've got the Avantone grot box in the middle there, which I can use as a mono reference, just to see that, you know, is what I'm working on coming across well without being, you know, stereo spread and without having any low end or super high end. And so I thought, you know what, I'll try the NS10s. They had a big, well, I'm going to call them NS10s probably multiple times in this video. They're not Yamahas, but they're based on the same design, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I ran SonarWorks using them plus my sub, and I was really quite taken aback with how I liked the result. The frequency graph was all over the show, especially above, I think it was 8K to 14K. There's a massive lift from SonarWorks because the original didn't do it, and there was a big scoop around 1K, which must be roughly where the crossover is between the woofer and the 1-inch tweeter. And so once SonarWorks had compensated for that, it was as if kind of a blanket had been lifted off everything that I've been working on for years. I was really just blown away by how suddenly I could pick out details that I hadn't been picking out before, especially on guitars, which a lot of the music that I work on is very guitar based, and so is the stuff that Ramesh works on, and I think maybe that's what really made it kind of click, that what I'm looking for on my monitoring system is I'm looking for nastiness, harsh, kind of 2K to 5K, that range to stand out for me and really not be very nice. I'm looking for bad things in the mix to really stand out and make themselves obvious to me quickly. Now, I have heard other speakers that do this. Amphions are a great example, where the Amphion 218s, I think, my good friend John Brown has got those, and those do a very similar job of really highlighting that upper mid stuff when it's not right. But those cost, with the amplifier, they're something like £7,000, like $6,000 to $7,000, $8,000, that kind of range. That's a huge amount of money that I just don't have to spend. And so I got thinking, and then I started swapping speakers round, and so the first thing I did is I put the NS10 clones in what I've considered for years my main monitor position, and suddenly something was lost. And it turns out, again, doing some research, it looks like that speaker right there and the one that's off camera, it looks like they're way too wide. It looks like they're inappropriately far apart. But what I've come to realize is I sit further back from the monitors than you might think, because this console behind me, the camera doesn't really do it justice, that it's quite deep. I'm a good kind of 4 feet back from where the NS10s are, and I got out a protractor and did the angle measurements and all that kind of stuff, and it turns out that the white cone speakers, the NS10s, are about a 35-degree off center for me, because that's 45, so they're actually in the right position, and the Eve audios are too close, which is my fault. And I'm considering moving the Eves up onto the NS10s to have them in a similar position, but then they will be too high. It looks, again, on the camera is quite deceptive. It looks like the white cone speakers are too high. It looks like they're about that much above my listening kind of height, but if I sit up straight and turn around, you'll see they're actually just about perfect. It's an optical illusion because this room, kind of the floor goes up a little at this side because of the floating floor and everything. It's a bit like a forced perspective kind of thing, like the Disney castles that look further away and make everything else look bigger. It's not accurate. Everything in here, if I turn round, I'm about 4.5 feet away from the speakers in an almost perfect equilateral triangle. Only one set of monitors that I have can be in that spot. And so I decided then I got out the old foam pads for them, and that was working really well. Then I tested out with a couple of reference tracks. One of my favourite references that I use is a song called Hey Now by London Grammar. The first half is really kind of delicate. It's got a big reverb that comes in on the vocal that kind of, it should still be that the vocal is perfectly mono. In fact, that speaker behind me, the cube, it should sound like the vocal's coming out of the cube. But the reverb sits around it. And then this ridiculous sub comes in. And I could hear this kind of sound when the sub came in. And I worked out that the amplifier that I was using was pushing all the sub frequencies to the NS10s and causing the cones to really have a lot of excursion, which wasn't right. So the first thing I did, I looked in my old racks of gear and I found a crossover, because I've had this two-way crossover in my kit for ages. And what I'm doing with it is I'm removing everything below about 70-80 hertz from the amplifier that's powering them. So the sub is the only thing making that low frequency stuff. I mean, these speakers couldn't accurately replicate that anyway, but it was causing the speakers to have a massive excursion and really kind of not do the job. But Adam, you might say, surely your subwoofer's got one of those filters in, like 85 hertz filter. It does. But if I use that, then I can't use the sub with my other speakers. So I'm using the Audient Nero, which is behind me, which is a 3-way monitor switcher with a lot of other cool features, including a switchable sub. And so the sub goes out of that on its own separate channel, which, you know, that means that I can control it independently and listen to the tops without the sub on if I need to take away the low end for a minute just to listen to what the mid-range is doing without being distracted. And it also does things like, you know, mono fold down, phase reverse of one side to check all that kind of stuff. This is really useful for that. And so if I was to route through the sub, which has that filter which would do that for the power amp, I would lose the ability to use that sub with the other channels. Don't want that. Plus, I'm going to be using this sub in the Dolby Atmos setup that's coming very soon. And I'm using the 2 inputs on the sub, one from the Nero for the stereo configuration and one from the new Atmos configuration. I'm only going to be using one at a time, but it means I don't have to constantly rewire or repatch anything, and I can use a common device of not having to buy 2 subs, and that should work really quite nicely there. Because it's being mono folded down from the Nero, from the low end, from the rest of the signal. It's also going to be a separate LFE channel for the Atmos, and so with only one on at a time, that should work really well. Now, I said I was going to talk about the construction of the speakers and why it's relevant. A near-field monitor like the Eve Audios there, the SC207s, they are ported. That means in the Eve's case, there's a big hole on the back. Some of them will have a circular port. This one's got kind of a big flappy kind of hole. And what that does is it turns the whole kind of speaker into a resonant chamber. And that means that the low end can really kind of boom out of these speakers more than they have any right to be able to do, based on what the speakers and the design should otherwise be able to do. The downside of that is then, yes, the cabinet of the speaker is resonating. In this case, it's firing a lot of that backwards at the wall. With the old Adam A7s that I had, that was firing that air at me. And that can cause some issues with kind of the low end not being nearly so well defined, which can have a knock-on effect on the mid-range not being very defined because the speaker and the enclosure are fighting with each other. It's not so much a problem on larger monitors, like you'll see main, far field monitors, the big things that have got ports on. Those are usually tuned really low and are kind of trying to help those speakers reproduce things like 30 Hz, 35, 40 Hz, where on the SC207s, that's reproducing 60, 70 Hz, maybe 50, but it's doing that at the cost of kind of a compromise in design. The NS10s and their clones have a different compromise of design, which is that they are a sealed cabinet. There are no ports, which means the low-end response of them is pants. It's terrible. They don't really do bass. They definitely don't do sub bass, and they barely do any kind of low-end at all, really. And that's okay, because the upside of that is that the mid-range then is much clearer and punchier because the cabinet isn't allowed to resonate at those lower frequencies. So what's coming at me is less clouded by that kind of warm thing going on in the low end. That is left to the subwoofer to be doing that, and the different sizes and efficiencies of subs will give you clearer low end. I'm currently using an Adam Sub 8. I'm hoping in future to get something bigger and more powerful. Not sure who from yet. Might be Eve Audio. But something that, again, the port on that can be less of a thing, and so it can be more of a solid reproduction. This that I have is great, and the kind of the setup that I have is, I think, the best that I've ever had in terms of what works for me. The genres that I work on is probably quite relevant. If you work on a lot of music that has kind of a sparse mid-range, doesn't have much going on there, but has kind of a thick low end, like, pop music or, I don't know, R&B, rap, that kind of stuff, maybe this isn't the solution for you. Maybe for you, something like the SC207s or the 208s or the 3-ways that Eve do, or another solution might be the perfect setup for you. In the right room, acoustic treatment comes first, everybody. Don't forget that. If you can get your acoustic treatment right, then this is all about flavors inside that. But for me, that kind of nasty top end on the tweeters here that are not like the folded ribbon tweeters in the Eves are really smooth, and they give me a really clear kind of representation of everything. I'm looking for something a bit more bad, actually. And the paper woofers in these SN10s, NS10s, they're not designed to be super flexible. They have resonances going on. They have issues that a lot of kind of car stereos, a lot of AirPods, all that kind of stuff, HomePods, all that kind of thing, will have a lot of these issues. And so if it translates well in that situation with, again, SonarWorks has kind of flattened out the EQ response for me, but it can't change physics. It can't stop these speakers from being paper cones and dome tweeters, as much as Sonarworks can't stop the Eves from having that kind of carbon fibre-y, Kevlar-y kind of speaker and the ribbon tweeter. So it's still good for me to have both of these things, because I can switch between them, and one will give me a kind of a more studio type thing, and one will give me a more whoa kind of thing, which it seems to be more beneficial to me. And I mix on headphones a lot of the time as well, really bounce back and forth between all these options. And so having these options now in the best possible setup for me is really kind of a good thing. And the last thing is that I found that the power amp I was using, which was a trusty old Samson, this old thing, I was getting well over 50% of power usage on this thing. And especially when I was pushing at louder volumes, but not even louder as in like deafening volumes, but getting to 90, 95 dB, you know, you're supposed to mix at 85, but sometimes I'll push it just to test things. It was kind of saturating a little bit. And what I really wanted was a power amplifier with a lot of headroom, a faster slew rate, so that the amplifier side of things could be as accurate as it reasonably could be without spending silly money. Now again, my mate John Brown has an old Yamaha amplifier, the P2500, and he used it while I was at his one time with some stuff, and I was really impressed with the clarity that was giving. I mean, when we're talking changing out power amps, it's a tiny difference compared to the speakers themselves and the positioning and the room acoustics and all that. So don't go for this first, but with the right room treatment, with the right positioning, me being in the right position, Sonarworks, all the rest, then the next mile for me was getting this power amp. And so I got the P3500, which is, I think it can go up to 350 watts a side at 8 ohms, these being 8 ohm speakers, which is way more than those speakers could ever handle. So I definitely won't be running the amp anywhere near its full power, but what that means is that it will be really comfortably working within its operating range, which means that it's going to be able to push and pull that speaker physically with the highest degree of efficiency. Are there better power amps than this? Probably, but the amount of money that I would spend would suddenly go crazy, like the Amphions with their 700 watt amplifier that with the 218 speakers is 6 or 7 grand. This on Reverb cost me £180, and I remember buying these speakers off studiospares.com for £110. So one of the kind of monitoring systems that I've been the most happy with in years cost me less than a pair of the Eve Audios, which again is not a knock on Eve, just to be clear. Those guys are wonderful, their speakers are great, they fill a slightly different role than these kind of horrible honking white boxes. And another little benefit, just before I go, is that Sonarworks has quite an extreme correction to make them sound more kind of hi-fi. If I turn that calibration off, I get NS10 mode. I get to hear that kind of original, very boxy, very 1K forward kind of tone without having to have special speakers with the kind of, you know, the white speaker, you know, the NS10 mode in them, like some speakers have, like Barefoots. I think the Key Audios have that mode in. There's quite a few kind of high-end speakers that have that kind of mode that makes them sound like these, and I can make them sound like those by just turning off the correction. So that gives me another kind of angle. So I've essentially, because of that, got 4 sets of monitors here, and all with switchable sub. Really useful, and it's soon going to be 5 sets of monitors if you've not already seen that, because of the Atmos thing that's going to be happening very soon. So if that's not already out, the whole Atmos thing, then I'm really excited to show you that. Thanks everybody for tuning in. It's been a lot of fun talking about this, and yeah, check out the Ramesh pack from 2 Notes, which is the reason that I was at his studio. This isn't a sponsored video, this is just me giving Ramesh a shout out, because I do like working with 2 Notes and Ramesh, he was lovely. But yeah, thanks to the patrons on Patreon for helping to support me and for helping me to do projects like this with the new power amp and kind of digging out the old NS10 style kind of philosophy. And thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.